Hello, I'm Pika, and welcome back. When you ask a group of Splatoon players what their least favorite game mode is, Clam Blitz will more often than not be your number one answer. The mode is decentralized, complex, and heavily team-oriented, which can make it difficult to understand and play well. Sometimes it can feel like a miracle is required to get all the clams you need at the right place and time to make anything happen. However, with the right understanding and approach to the mode and its mechanics, it's possible to manipulate the mode to consistently work in your favor, and that's what I want to talk about today. Before I begin, I want to give credit where it's due. The first part of this video will cover the mechanics of the mode from behind the scenes, and that data would be nearly impossible to get without information provided by OatmealDome. They are an established data miner within the scene, and a few years back they released an article that details all sorts of specifics about how Clam Blitz functions, which is where much of the data in this video is sourced from. Another shout out needs to go out to Lily, who first brought this data and its implications to my attention long ago, and is primarily responsible for developing the strategies related to these mechanics that will be presented later on. I'll leave links to both people's Twitters and to Oatmeal's Clam article below. With all that out of the way, let's get right into it. A great place to begin with discussing Clam Blitz is to review the basics of how the clams in question actually spawn. There are two spawning methods for normal clams, the first of which being what the game code refers to as emit areas. These are broad regions in which clams will be randomly scattered at the very beginning of each match. Each stage has its own set of emit areas, and each area has an assigned number of clams that will be generated within it. The total number of clams combined from all emit area spawns will always equal 30, meaning every match at Clam Blitz begins with 30 active clams on the map. Since they are only relevant early on in matches, fully understanding and memorizing emit areas isn't too crucial to do, but it can be useful if you're looking to find the best ways to build a power clam early on in a match, or if you're trying to prevent your opponent from doing so. These visuals of all maps and their emit areas can be found in OatmealDome's clams article, as can the maps with the locations of all clam pods. Speaking of, the more prevalent and well-known spawning method for clams is through clam pods. Like emit areas, pods have predetermined and set locations on every map, except they are more plentiful and are responsible for all ongoing clam spawns during a game. Pods always generate clams in sets of 4. The number of clam pods on each map varies, with some maps having far more than others. The layout of clam pods on any map is always symmetrical between the two teams' sides, giving neither side an inherent advantage. If you play Clam Blitz often, I strongly recommend you take a look at OatmealDome's clam pod maps and get an idea as to where pods are most concentrated on each map, since that information is not only generally helpful to know about when playing the mode, but will also be important for a technique that will be covered later on. Before going much further, let's also review how the game decides when and where to spawn clams in pods. As a general rule, the game always aims to have 50 clams active in play at any time. Active clams include normal clams that are on the ground and those that are held by players, but does not include power clams. This means that the pity power clam that spawns after a basket closes does not influence the number of active clams on the map, and when a player gathers 10 clams to create a power clam, the number of active clams registered by the game actually drops by 10. When the game detects that the number of active clams is less than 50 by 4 or more, it will begin to queue up spawns at pod locations. By default, this queue time lasts 12 seconds, meaning the game will attempt to spawn clams 12 seconds after it identifies that clam numbers are low. However, it is also possible for clam spawning to enter an accelerated state, reducing the spawn delay down to only 4 seconds. This sped up state only activates when there are either less than 25 active clams on the map at any time, or if the game enters overtime and neither team is yet to score points. When it comes to choosing which pod to spawn clams at, the process is essentially random at first. Any pod on the map is equally likely to be selected for a spawning attempt, regardless of what side of the map it is on, how close or far it is from the basket, or anything else. Notice how I said spawning attempt though, since there is a way for clam generation at a pod location to fail. Immediately before the spawn queue ends for new clams to generate, the game checks the pod it has selected to see if it is occupied. For a pod to be considered occupied, there needs to either be a player or pre-existing clams on the ground in that pod as it is checked. If either of those conditions are met, the game will not spawn any clams at that location and will immediately try a different pod instead at random. Although initial pod selection for clam spawns is random, there is one exception. As mentioned before, the layout of clam pods on any map is perfectly symmetrical. Besides for the obvious reason of keeping things fair between the two teams, this mechanic is also utilized by the game when spawning clams. If at any point a pod does manage to spawn new clams, the next spawn attempt will always be at the mirrored pod from that location. This attempt can fail due to pod occupancy just like any other instance, but it is intended to help keep the distribution of clams around the map even for both sides. This can be useful to know when trying to push forward, since if you see a new set of clams that spawn somewhere on your side of the map, you know that more clams are soon to arrive at the mirrored location for your opponent, helping you decide where you can flank to finish building a power clam and score. I've spent a while dissecting the ins and outs of how clam spawning works. but all of it is important to understand if you want to know how to break the game mode. Before finally diving in, I want to again preface this by stating that this is also not my own discovery. This concept was first explained to me by Lily, and we've since then worked together to push it to its limits. It's all led up to this, it's time to discuss the technique of clam pod locking. Pod locking revolves around the pod occupancy mechanic discussed previously. It aims to use it to manipulate the distribution of clams as much as possible. By our definition, a pod is locked when a player picks up 3 out of the 4 clams that it spawns, intentionally leaving the last clam behind without ever touching it. As long as the clam is never touched by a player, it will never despawn. This means that as long as a clam is left behind in a pod and never contacted, that clam will never leave, and therefore that pod will never not be occupied, effectively locking it from spawning new clams indefinitely. Locking clam pods achieves several things. The most basic thing is that it still gives you a fair amount of clams to work with, which is rather important considering you won't be getting much done in this mode without them. Compared to grabbing all 4 clams though, it locks future spawns in that location as stated previously, and also keeps the number of free clams on the ground in that area low. With all of this said, how is this technique best used in real games? Of course it's not a good idea to lock every pod on the map, since that will keep clams from spawning at all and won't let either team get much done. The most basic way of putting it is that you should aim to keep pods near your own team's basket locked, and to keep pods near the opponent's basket unlocked. This accomplishes 2 major things. The first of which is that by keeping as few clams on the ground on your team's side as possible, you make it much more difficult for any opponents to sneak into your base and build a power clam undetected, meaning that in most cases, they have to build a clam on their side and then push in, which gives you more than enough time to react and defend. The other thing is that by denying clam spawns on your side, the game is left with no choice but to spawn all clams on the opponent's side of the map. This not only accomplishes the reverse of what I described and makes it easy for you to gather and score clams on your own push, but also concentrates all new clam spawns near you and your team after you open the enemy basket and are actively scoring. This keeps you from having to travel far at all to gather more clams and continue scoring, giving some pushes the potential to absolutely snowball in your favor. To further this idea, you can also lock any pods that may be far out of the way of either team's basket purely to save yourself the time otherwise spent removing yourself from the fight to check that location again and again throughout the game. Those are all the basics of pod locking, but while I'm still talking about clam spawning mechanics, I also want to mention one thing I see many players do while playing Clam Blitz that isn't as effective as they might think. Oftentimes while defending, I'll see players grab as many clams as possible so that their opponents can't take them instead. This is not a bad decision at all, but it is worth mentioning that you should absolutely avoid generating a power clam in these situations. As mentioned before, power clams do not count towards the active clam total on the map, which means that generating one reduces the clam count and forces new spawns to occur. If your intention is to keep as many clams out of play as possible on defense, it is best to keep locking pods near your basket and to be sure to only hold 9 or less clams yourself. Otherwise you might cause new pods to spawn that the other team ends up taking anyway. I'll keep this quick as to avoid this video running into overtime itself, but before I go I do want to briefly detail the conditions in which overtime will or will not initiate in Clam Blitz, since I see players of all skill levels still get confused by it frequently. Overtime will begin if either no points have been scored yet from either team, if the losing team has a power clam somewhere on the map as the timer hits 0, or if the winning team's basket is opened as time runs out. Overtime will end if any of the following things happen. The losing team does not open the basket within 20 seconds, the losing team loses their power clams, the winning team's clam basket closes and the lead does not shift, the winning team scores on the losing team, or if the lead shifts to the other team. The overtime conditions for this mode are by far the most complex, so there's definitely a lot to keep in mind, but understanding them can save you a lot of confusion down the line. So there you have it, the ins and outs of Clam Blitz and how to abuse them. Although the mode has a lot to keep in mind while playing it, I find that the depth and creativity that comes from the mode's design makes it one of my favorites to play. Considering the general opinions on the mode by the community at this point, I sadly would not be surprised if Clam Blitz did not make a return in Splatoon 3. Regardless of how much longer it is with us, I hope this video helped you to understand and appreciate it at least a little bit more. That's all from me, so thanks for watching, and have a good one.